Welcome to this session on urbanism and the land. Hopefully that's where you intend to be, because that's where you are right now. My name is Susan Mudd, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session this afternoon. I will be introducing two panelists very shortly, but I wanted to give a little background to the session before we get underway. The New Urbanist Charter, to which New Urbanists ascribe, makes clear our respect for the land, other species, and nature. There are numerous references in the New Urbanism Charter, such as farmland and nature are as important to the metropolis as the garden is to the house. A range of, I'm reading from different sections of the Charter. These do not normally flow in this order, but I'm just giving you a couple reminders of what we hold dear in the New Urbanism. A range of parks, from tot lots and village greens to ball fields and community gardens, should be distributed within neighborhoods. Conservation areas and open lands should be used to define and connect different neighborhoods and districts. Architecture and landscape design should grow from local climate, topography, history, and building practices. Preservation and renewal of historic buildings, districts, and landscapes affirm the continuity and evolution of urban society. So now I'm moving outside the Charter, so the language will not be as beautiful. New urbanist developments and plans include green spaces, plazas, and places where people can gather and both actively and passively interact with nature. New urbanists seek to make attractive street life as a trade-off or in exchange for people living in high-density locations. As a movement, new urbanism has differences with landscape urbanism, where green often doesn't include density, the grid, or room for people. Landscape urbanism sometimes fails to recognize the green benefits of density, and in an attempt to make each of its buildings or projects green, sometimes does not allow the density that has overall other economic and environmental benefits. This session looks at the ways to reconcile biophilia and humans' desire and need for contact with nature with the density that new urbanism also adheres to. At the opening plenary, Richard Louv brought us and the world documentation of humans' desire and need for contact with nature, and reminded us that the frequency of contact does make a difference, increasing our abilities and our happiness. So new urbanisms and new urbanists' struggles with regulatory standards where people in densely populated areas are not always allowed access to the waterfront, which can provide that contact, is an ongoing struggle. Today we're going to hear from two professionals new to the Congress for New Urbanism, working on projects and policies here in the Mountain West, in which there are issues around and efforts to connect humans with nature. First, we will hear from Laura Hanson. Laura lives right in this area of Salt Lake. She is the executive director of the Jordan River Commission. The Jordan River Commission is a relatively new interlocal cooperation of 3 counties, 10 cities, 2 special service districts, and dozens of community partners. So think about that on a daily basis. Working together to implement an ambitious vision for the 50-mile-long Jordan River corridor, which connects to Salt Lake. The vision for the river includes recreation, open space preservation, habitat restoration, water quality improvements, regional transportation connections, and community building focused on highlighting the river corridor. Laura has applied her 12 years of professional planning experience as a consultant, developing both long-range community plans, and natural resource management plans to her newer position with the Jordan River Commission. She's now enjoying the tangible work of implementing such a plan for the Jordan River. Laura holds bachelor degrees in urban planning and environmental studies and a master of urban planning from the University of Utah. Her work has been recognized with numerous awards from the Quality Growth Commission, as well as the Utah chapters of the APA and the American Society for Landscape Architects. So please join me in welcoming Laura Hanson to the stage.
Thank you for that great introduction, and I'm so honored to be here on this panel with these two. I'm really excited. I told Dan this morning, I said, I just want to hear, let's just fast forward to your remarks. I can't wait to hear what he has to say. So thank you all for taking the time to come join us. I hope you learned something and learn a little bit more about Utah. So. As Susan mentioned, I'm the director of the Jordan River Commission, and just for those of you who are not from the area, this is an image of the Wasatch Front. And we have Utah Lake down here. This is in Utah County. The river flows north through 15 different cities into Salt Lake County, and so here's Salt Lake City proper right here. Oh, I'm sorry, right here. Salt Lake City proper, and then spills into the Great Salt Lake up in Davis County. So 3 different counties, 15 different cities. And it was named the Jordan River because it sort of parallels the Jordan River in the Middle East, flowing from a freshwater body to a saltwater body, and also flows north, which is just a little interesting bit of trivia. But you know, this is the state's most heavily populated region, and so it's faced a lot of issues along the way, which you can see here. This is an image of the Jordan River in 1937. In a city called Murray. You can see all these meanders, the natural meanders and the wide floodplain. And then in 1990, you can see the river has been straightened and essentially turned into a canal through much of the city, and the development is coming up quite close to it in many places. And as most of you probably know, rivers are dynamic. They move. They don't necessarily stay where you want them to stay. And so this is a graphic that shows historic river channels in kind of the southern section of the river over a long period of time, and all the different places that it's meandered across the corridor. And then even since it was straightened, like in those, that image I showed you previously, you can see that it's still, you know, in some places it stays a little bit tighter, but even when we put our very best efforts into making sure the river doesn't move, it still moves. So Utah Lake was at the bottom of the first slide, and it provides all the water that flows into the Jordan River. There are a few tributaries and stormwater that contributes to it as well, but the majority of it comes from Utah Lake. And the Jordan River is really unique in that it follows no sort of natural hydrologic cycle. Normally a river really swells in the spring and then it drops down in the late summer and fall. And the water in the Jordan River does that to some degree, but it's all controlled by some guy with a gate at the mouth of Utah Lake, and he opens it when the water users say it's time to open it and closes it when it's time to close it. And that time was set by a legal agreement that said we have a compromise level. The water in Utah Lake can rise no higher than the level it was at statehood. And so we call that the compromise level. It's sort of silly the way that it's worked out. But so this last column here is referring to that legal agreement, the height, the elevation of Utah Lake. And so we've had a cycle of really high water years along the Jordan River and in this region, what you would normally call a 100-year flood event. But you can see that they're closer to a 30-year cycle here in Utah. And so we've had these peak years here, the years in between those peaks. And we had a really high water year in 2011. But if you can see the elevation of Utah Lake, 2011 was not as high as this previous year. So was this our last big year? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we've got another one coming. This is an image of homes inundated near the Jordan River in 1909. A lot of this water is not only coming from the Jordan River, but also from some other tributaries, City Creek and things that flow through the city as well. But homes inundated in 1909 and again in 1952. In 1952, there was so much water in the streams that they actually routed the water down, not intentionally in this case, but it flowed over city streets in downtown Salt Lake, and a few kids took advantage of that. It happened again in 1983, and this time it was a little bit more intentional. You can see the sandbags there. This is State Street. This is just, 1 block away was a river in 1983. In that same year, this is a picture of the Jordan River here, and the water was coming very close to taking out this entire bridge. And this is a picture in 2011 where we're seeing essentially the same thing. So, rivers do their thing, and we can't always control what they do. And so somehow we need to be able to accommodate and leave room for them to do what they do. And what happens if we don't? This is the Santa Clara River, which is down in the southeastern corner of the state of Utah by St. George. And this big empty spot here used to be a cul-de-sac. There were homes right there. Interestingly, they were not built in the 100-year floodplain, but they were within what was called the meander corridor, that winding corridor through which the river naturally meanders. And it's really expensive. 15 homes were lost in this event, 25 more were condemned, 5 roadway bridges were taken out. And so we need to do a better job in planning for rivers, but still allowing for development and growth within our communities. This is an aerial image of the Jordan River flowing out of Utah Lake in one of those peak flood years, 1984. And a little bit farther up, you can see how close the development has come to the river is over here, how close the development has encroached on the river in many places. And unfortunately, we've got a few problems. This is a homeless camp. There are several homeless camps along the river, and occasionally you hear of some really awful incidences of crime, and the news sensationalizes those. And the water quality in the river was quite poor back in the 50s. It's improved significantly since then, but a lot of people in the community here, especially sort of the older generations, still have a real stigma. Or the river has a stigma, and it's thought of as unsafe and dirty and not a place that you want to be. But it's actually quite beautiful if you go out to the right places. It's really incredible. We have a trail, the Jordan River Parkway Trail, that parallels the river. Will be completed in the next couple of years. We only have a couple gaps left. There's a paved multi-use trail and an equestrian trail. We're working on making it navigable so you could boat from lake to lake. There's a few sections you can do that in and a few sections that are problematic. Lots of parks, community fishing areas. You can see the bridge across the river. It's really a great place. It gets tons of use. And it's amazing. You can find fox, you can find deer, you can find all different kinds of wildlife in the middle of our urbanized corridor. And we've had some great success stories. This is the Legacy Nature Preserve, which was set aside as part of a lawsuit, actually, but ended up preserving over 2,000 acres of open space at essentially the delta of the Jordan River as it flows into the Great Salt Lake, and it's improved significantly. And so all of that has been happening. The river's been improving slowly, gaining traction, and a few people started to recognize, hey, you know what, maybe we could think about this a little bit more thoughtfully and more purposefully, and ask the community what they'd like to see. And so Envision Utah, I'm sure many of you have heard a little bit about Envision Utah. Back in '98, we had a regional planning process with Peter Calthorpe and John Frickanese helped with that. And this nonprofit organization, Envision Utah, helped envision how our region will grow over the time, or how the community wanted the region to grow. And the process by doing that was showing a variety of different scenarios and asking the community to say, this is the scenario that I think fits best or is the best choice for our region. So that same process was applied to the Jordan River corridor. Again, 4 different scenarios presented, and you can see the vast majority of the public wanted to see it remain as a green corridor with opportunities for recreation and some limited spaces for community development, neighborhoods, and more urban environments. They were also asked about recreation, and trails and wildlife viewing became kind of the top ideas there. And all of the public input that was gathered was culminated in this report, the Blueprint Jordan River. So this is sort of my Bible. Our organization was tasked with implementing this document. And it includes a number of big ideas, one of which is preservation and restoration. So if we look at the existing corridor and re-envision what it could look like moving forward into the future with open space preserves and educational interpretation opportunities, If we look at the river as it is today and envision how we could use it for more recreation, the train is not a mistake. That actually, the front runner train actually goes right through this area, right next to the river. So it's quite constrained in that area, but offers some interesting opportunities. And then in the areas where we have development that's encroached quite closely onto the river already, are there ways that we can re-envision those areas? And we have river centers. We have a place where you could rent a bicycle, grab a cup of coffee, eat on a cafe overlooking the river and watch people boating by. Can we make the river more of a focal point and a centerpiece for our community, since it especially flows right through the center of our metropolitan region? The blueprint also includes efforts for environmental education as well. And there are a series of maps. This is just the very northernmost tip. And we had the Olympics here, the Winter Olympics in 2002. And so sort of modeling on the gold, silver, bronze medal system, the entire corridor was assigned a level of environmental opportunity. So this is based on how close the development has come to the river corridor already. Gold being you have the most distance. This is that Legacy Nature Preserve. So gold being you have the most width of buffer space, silver being less than that, and bronze a little bit tighter. And the big idea is, nature, open space preservation, completion of the trail, environmental education, those river centers I talked about, a variety of different things. And then the document includes an action plan as well that's divided into 8 different categories, which basically say, here are the things that we need to do to implement this vision. And they're very sort of goals and objective level type language. So, plant native species, preserve a buffer, things like that. And so it's feel-good stuff, but it's hard to know exactly how to implement it at this point. But what is really useful is that it has a series of guiding principles. And I don't know why my slide's so dark, sorry. But these guiding principles, in theory, should guide all of the work that the communities do along the way, preserving and rehabilitating natural river features, establishing buffers, restoring habitat, replacing the devices that are barriers to boating, reducing hardscape, managing stormwater on site, balancing needs, incorporating the river into education and signage, design standards for complementary development, encouraging regional transportation, and connecting communities to the river corridor. And so this is a picture of me. This is down at an area we call the Point of the Mountain. This is Salt Lake County in this end here, and Utah County in this end. And you can see how the corridor is quite tight in this area. This is the Jordan River here. This is a canal. And this is where the new commuter rail line goes in here. And in this area, these are the different stakeholders that all have a role. This is one of the most heavily regulated rivers in Utah. It's crazy. It's, there's private property. In the West, every single drop of water is privately owned. And so that adds a whole different mix because you've got the water users and the water conservancy districts in there as well. And so it's a lot of work. We have a lot of stakeholders. And so the idea that said, they finished this blueprint document and they said, well, now what do we do with this? How do we implement it? And the idea was that you take all of those different stakeholders and you create an organization that has this as their task. And so that's the Jordan River Commission. This is our current membership. We partner with a lot of other people that are not on here. This is just the makeup of our board. And we have no regulatory authority. We are all carrot, no stick. And so all we can do is encourage and educate and nicely ask people to do what we want them to do. But we're making some progress, and I think little bit by little bit we're building the public support to potentially grow to a point where we have a little bit more regulatory authority at some point in the future. We have sort of divided our work into 3 different areas. So capital projects, which could include the production of a document, but tangible products that we're working on producing, education and outreach, and then technical advice and guidance to our member governments. And because of that stigma that I mentioned, a lot of our work has been focused on getting public support for the river, changing people's minds about this. And so we've been doing that through volunteer events and a variety of different things. Completing the trail, we've been looking for funding and legislation to allow for ease of completing the trail system. We've produced a trail map that's not only informative but educational and fun as well. And then we've recently just, we're kind of concluding a document which is a best practices for riverfront communities toolbox. And I'd like to highlight this and one other project in a little bit more detail for you. Basically taking that Blueprint Jordan River document, which is this very high-level visioning document. I came to this job and I said, well, this is great, but how do I implement this? It's so broad, it's so general. We need a how-to guide for people. And so this was sort of our solution to that. And you're all, as new urbanists, familiar with the concept of transects. We've taken a transect to the river corridor and used it as a way to structure this document. And so if you take this and apply it to any segment of the river corridor, these various segments or transects here can vary in width and may not even be existent in some cases. And obviously it would be mirrored on the other side, but you've got the river, a natural environment buffer, manicured open space and agriculture, and our built environment. And then some transition zones. And so you can access this document by location, the context of where you're working, or also the category. So the red is land use, this greenish yellow color is environment, this is recreation, stormwater, and then we have several utility corridors that also cross the river. And for each of those colored bars, you'll find in the document a best practices toolbox sheet. So this is an example for the Enhance the River buffer. And we've tried very hard to make this a really practical tool and one that people don't just stick it on the shelf and say, okay, that was a great exercise, now let's go back to business as usual. But we talk about why it's important, how you would, what benefits you get, what considerations to take in mind, implementation costs, long-term management, technical resources if you want to dig into more information, kind of a how-to window on that, and then associated best practices. And I think the most valuable piece of all of this is local project sources. And so for every one of these examples, we've tried to find a place here locally where a city or a developer or a homeowner or a nonprofit organization could go and see exactly how somebody's implemented this and have a contact person to say, well, what worked for you and what didn't work for you, and what lessons have you learned, what would you do differently? We've also included a bunch of implementation tools in the back. So this is a matrix which I know you're not going to be able to read, but again, those same best practice categories follow along the top here. We have a series of users, so cross-jurisdictional stakeholders, like transportation agencies and utility corridors, local government planning, local government regulations, developers, architects, builders, homeowners associations, and property owners, which could be, you know, somebody, a nonprofit or an agricultural producer, and then mechanisms through which you can implement these. So long-range regional planning, zoning ordinances, capital improvement plans, CC&Rs, developer agreements, conservation easements. And so you can find different ways to incorporate these tools into the work that you're doing based on who you are. We've also included an annotated outline of a riparian protection ordinance. So the ultimate goal of this is for our local government, since I don't have any regulatory teeth, is to get the local governments to adopt an ordinance which does have the teeth to actually preserve a little bit more open space in the river and work to design developments that are near the river in such a way that they reach out, they embrace the river, they don't turn their back on it, but they make it a focal point of their community. And so the main sections, but then also model language from other ordinances around the country. A community self-evaluation checklist is another tool. So this is something that if you are a city council member, you could go through this and say, do we have an ordinance? Yes, check. Do we participate in community awareness building events and educational programs? Check, yes. Oh, no, we don't do this. So this is something that we could add to as we're working on becoming a more river-friendly community. We also have a development checklist. So a lot of city planners have checklists within their existing planning processes already. So as a site plan comes in, they review it against their ordinances and various things and say, yes, you do this. No, you don't meet this. Oh, wow, I gotta go fast. And so this is a way to incorporate that into their planning process. The other project I wanted to highlight is the Big Bend Restoration Project. This is Sandy and West Jordan, and you can see this big shape up here. This is the Sharon Steel tailings pile. It was a Superfund site that has been remediated. And the area that we're talking about is the Big Bend Restoration Site is here. You can see the river comes along here. It used to meander right through where the tailings pile is now, and it's been remeandered to go around that. It's covered in invasive species right now. There's a lot of erosion, and we have some cultural artifacts on site. And so the plan here is to actually re-meander the river, so to take it out of its banks, its current bank, and re-meander it through this river corridor, drop the elevation of the entire property to reconnect it with its floodplain. Provide boardwalks, urban fishing, interpretation for education, connections to local, a nearby track station and a shopping area, connection to a local neighborhood right here. And we can create an amenity, not a liability, with fishing, opportunities for wildlife viewing, and I mentioned the track station here as well. And so this is a very big project. It has about a $4 million price tag. We've raised a little bit of money already so far. We've got $250,000 for the design of the river channel itself. We have about $750 in Superfund damage settlement money still available, but we can't spend that until we have a design for it. There's still a big funding shortfall, so we're raising funds for doing that, but this is one of the last few opportunities we have to do something really amazing for the river corridor. And I think if it's successful, it's a model that we can use in other smaller projects and parcels along the entire river corridor. So I better wrap up. So I'm going to pass the time on to Dan. And then I think we're going to have time for questions afterwards. So. Take a minute to open up here. I thought we had it open already. In theory, it's open. Hopefully it'll pop up here soon.
Thank you, Laura. I'd like to next introduce Dan Leftwich. Dan comes to us from Denver, and he is in Boulder, excuse me, I know that, and I said the wrong thing. He's an attorney in Boulder, Colorado, and the founder of MindDrive Legal Services. Dan is working at a different scale than Laura. Laura's working on a 50-mile river here in Salt Lake. Dan is working in a variety of places, but many things in Boulder, on policies and practices and laws that will have the effect of allowing better human interaction with nature. So you're going to see two different types of approaches to working with human interaction with nature. Dan has an undergraduate degree in journalism and a law degree from the University of Texas School of Law, where he went with Scott Polikoff, I understand. During his 20-year span as an antitrust class action litigator in D.C., Dan was involved in some of the most complex cases in the nation addressing corporate monopoly power with his former law firm there. But beyond this traditional legal experience, Dan has a lifelong experience in the study of consciousness, nature, and the law. In 2008, he formed Evolutionary Law, which is dedicated to the promotion of a new form of earth jurisprudence to bring the rights of nature and humanity into balance, something we struggle with a lot at CNU. This work includes promotion of legal rights for nature, as well as sustainable rights to nature. Dan is a founding member of Boulder Rights of Nature, which is a group dedicated to establishing the legal rights of nature in Boulder County and beyond. For any of you who may remember Justice William O. Douglas's book, Should Trees Have Legal Standing? He's taking that to a new realm. Dan has received training from the ISIS Academy, the I'm going to mispronounce this one, Presencing Institute, and the Oneness University in India in sustainability and organizational change processes. So please join me in welcoming Dan Leftwich to the stage.
Sorry, it's not switching to PowerPoint for some reason. I'm having trouble with it, I'm sorry. There we go.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Laura, for that great presentation. I'm so impressed by the work you're doing, reconnecting humanity with nature. Again, my name is Dan Leftwich, and my law practice is called evolutionary law. My talk today will be about nature's role in sustainability. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look deep into nature, the principles underlying how nature works and its interaction in the built environment, in open space environments, and that interaction between humanity and nature. Einstein said, if you look deep into nature, you'll understand everything better. And he was somebody who took that seriously. Even though he was very cerebral, he understood the answers could be found in nature. So what's my connection to sustainability? First of all, I want to thank Scott Polikoff for the invitation to appear here and the CNU for having me. I'm a little bit of on the edge of the thought processes around these areas, and so I hope you'll bear with me. Wait until the end, and I hope it will all fit together. In 2007, after a 20-year career as an antitrust litigator, I had a deep transition, all the pressures of the world, seeing all the evolutionary changes on the planet, and I came across the great eco-philosopher Thomas Berry, Father Thomas Berry, and he really opened my eyes to the predicament that we're in, but also to, he called on all professions to shift from a human-centered view of the earth process to the earth-centered view. And for the legal profession, he called on us to do this, to achieve a viable human-earth situation. A new jurisprudence, earth jurisprudence, must articulate the conditions for the integral functioning of the earth process. That was my mission. I shifted everything in my law practice and decided it was my job to take all my experience in the law and begin to articulate how the earth process functions. So this is my version of the earth process. It begins with rights of nature. Thomas Berry was a strong advocate of the rights of nature, and I'll talk a little bit about that soon. And it also includes sustainable rights to nature. Those two things are connected. You can't have one without the other. Those two things create what's called biophilia, that innate connection that we have with the natural world. Biomimicry is learning from nature, and then there is a concept in nature, cooperation. Right? Nature is cooperative. There's coherence, ecological coherence. And all those things, when you put those principles in place in whatever it is that you're doing, you create the opportunities for what I call natural resilience and natural happiness, right? And wrapped around all of that, nature at its core is synergistic. Nature is synergy. Evolution is synergy. New dynamics coming together to create something else. So why rights of nature? Why do we care about recognizing the legal rights of nature? Well, there's a difference between problems and predicaments, all right? Problems, this woman on the left, she's got a problem. She's got one hand on the rock. The problems have fixes. They have solutions. They probably have technical solutions that, well, there's a way. She's got a rope. That's a good thing. She's got skill. She's got knowledge. She probably can find a way to get back to where she was, all right, to restore herself to a prior condition. Wile E. Coyote, on the other hand, he has a predicament. Okay? There's no way he's getting back to the top of that cliff. Right? The laws of nature dictate what's going to happen to Wile E. Coyote. He's going to have to manage a transition to a new state. And now, we know he's a cartoon character, okay? Puff of smoke, he gets up, he's in the next cartoon, right? We are not cartoon characters. We have a predicament. Thomas Berry made it clear to me, what opened my eyes was that he said, we're changing the biosystems, we're changing the geosystems on a scale of millions of years. We're terminating the last 65 million years of life development. Now that got my attention. Okay? That's a predicament. That requires a complete mind shift. What we have been doing has led us to this predicament. Your keynote speaker yesterday, I believe, Richard Louv, a friend and a real compatriot in the new nature movement, what he advocates for. He identified nature deficit disorder as a real modern-day malady that particularly impacts children. And so the Children in Nature Network have been doing great work in reconnecting children and families with nature in the urban environment and elsewhere. And that, just the identification of that disorder led me to think about it in a broader context. Nature deficit disorder is actually, in my view, the cause of the Earth community's predicament. All right? We've lost that connection, that deep, innate connection with nature. And so what happens when that occurs is you treat nature as property. You treat nature as just a resource, not as your habitat. Okay? Now, rights of nature, they're not ours to grant. They're not ours to deny. They come from existence. Just as Jefferson said, we have inalienable rights. We have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nature has rights. Okay? Thomas Berry said the most absurd thing in modern times is that only humans have rights. Every being to exist has three rights: the right to be, the right to habitat, and the right to play its role in the great community of existence. That includes humans. Okay? We're not separate from nature. We're not superior to nature. We have those rights. Now, the role that we have to play defines the rights. A tree has the right to play its unique, specific role in the environment. So the animals have rights. Okay? The birds have rights, a unique place in nature. The pollinators have rights, bees, butterflies. If you think that we can continue to degrade the environment to the point where bees don't exist and have no impact on humanity, then we have a rude awakening coming. Trees have rights. Pine trees in the West are under severe pressure. They provide a specific ecological service to mankind. The river has rights. But beyond morality and ethics, there's a simple fact. Nature will restore equilibrium with us or without us, and that's what it's doing right now. Climate change, all of the impacts that we're feeling in nature, is nature restoring equilibrium. It's setting limits, and it's saying, you will go no farther, otherwise there will be severe consequences. Now, the rights of nature are here already. Ecuador's constitution is the first on the planet to include legal rights for nature. Anyone in the country has standing to bring a case on behalf of nature. New Zealand recently granted the rights of personhood to its largest river. Figured if a corporation can be a person, so can a river. There's a global alliance for the rights of nature. And more than 24 cities now and towns in the United States have rights of nature ordinances. Cities are starting to make that connection between the rights of nature, rights to nature, and sustainability. So Santa Monica recently enacted a new sustainability ordinance that includes rights of nature and sustainable rights to nature. Where are the limits? And what it does is it recognizes that after 45 years of environmental protection at the national and state levels, those have failed. And it's up to cities now. It's up to local communities to empower their own citizens and to basically do what Justice Douglas said, give nature its own standing, to sue for its own preservation. Pittsburgh has enacted a Rights of Nature ordinance primarily in response to fracking. So sustainable rights to nature have to coexist with the rights of nature. That means nature is our habitat. Sustainable rights to nature is we need to have access to nature. It is what a Dutch human rights attorney calls the forgotten human right. Okay? We have a right to nature, a deep connection with it as an innate part of our being, not just as resources. And the Children of Nature Network and others are doing great things, and Laura's work, Jordan River Commission, these are all photos from the Jordan River Commission, showing people regaining that connection to nature. But some uses of nature violate the rights of nature. Okay? This is a fracking rig roughly 100 yards from a housing development in Colorado. 24/7 operation. We don't know what the chemical makeup is of the mix that goes into the earth. It violates the rights of nature, and so we have to work out those conflicts, right? Now this is Weld County, Colorado, one county east of Boulder County. Nearly 20,000 active oil and gas wells. That's the red, right? That little circle is where my friend Shane Davis, his house is. Now, and I give this information because local governments are under severe pressure right now from the resource extraction industry. It's impacting their ability to regulate, control land use, to make decisions about what's in the best interests of their community. And this is happening in communities, not just on the border, not just out in the plains. This is happening in neighborhoods. And so cities have to be aware of this and incorporate the rights of nature into the response. So when you have rights of nature and rights to nature, you're really focused on that. You create the conditions for biophilia. The great biologist E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia as the connections that human beings subconsciously seek with the rest of life. All right? Now, what is it? Well, it's nature, essentially. It's our connection to nature. We're hardwired with it. All right? We're not hardwired to live in cities, but we have to live in cities. And so we have to work out that interconnection between our innate need for nature and our inability to have it, because we have to live in dense environments. So there are biophilic cities that are emerging in the United States. And what are they? Well, there's a website, biophilic.org. It has a good definition, I think. They contain abundant nature. They care about, seek to protect, restore, and grow this nature. And they strive to foster deep connections and daily contact with the natural world. Now, what does that mean in the built environment? Well, so where do you start to do that? The first place to start is green everything. Anywhere you can green it, do it, right? And so you're probably all familiar with green infrastructure concepts, and I know there's a panel on that tomorrow. And green roofs, green walls, green walkways. This walkway is in the trees, is in Singapore. This is a natural habitat bridge in Banff, Canada. Now, I understand these are in open, expansive environments, but this concept of greening everything applies in the urban core as well. And some cities are really making progress in bringing parks everywhere that they can. Vancouver now has a Greenest City by 2020 program where their goal is to have a park within 5 minutes walking distance of every citizen, right? A park or a natural environment of some kind. There's now incentives being given by San Francisco, New York, Chicago for private citizens who own property in the urban environment to turn vacant property into parks or our urban gardens, community gardens. New York has a good plan to take thoroughfare islands and convert them all to green spaces, right? Packing nature in. It's not just for the access to nature. It recreates an environment in which biophilia can exist. Remember, biophilia is not just the green space. Biophilia is the connection, all right? And so the more people are in that connection, the more they feel biophilia. So some emerging biophilic cities, as far as I'm concerned, are Chicago, Boulder as a small example, Portland in the west, and Pittsburgh in the east. Internationally, Singapore is a great city for this. Now, it's besides, my view of biophilia is it goes beyond just green infrastructure, which is built up around stormwater management and kind of functional things, and all those are good, right? But green infrastructure now for these cities and others around the United States are really focused on biodiversity, bringing biophilia into the urban environment in order to restore biodiversity. One of the ways that they do that also is through biomimicry. And you've probably all heard about biomimicry. I'd highly suggest you go to Biomimicry 3.8, a website which really has been the leader in this area. They name it that because nature has had 3.8 billion years of sustainable development, of evolution to sustainable solutions. So it goes beyond designing buildings to look like nature, all right? Biomimicry also involves looking deep into nature and finding the lessons that nature has for the problems that you're experiencing in the urban design area or the urban planning area, right? So at its basic, of course, green infrastructure can be just a rain garden, right? It's very functional, and it also raises the level of biophilia because it's a space for access to nature. But then I have this slide of mushroom communities, right? What's that got to do with the urban environment? Well, Portland has been experimenting with eco-districts, the creation of eco-districts in the urban environment. So they had a challenge where they sent different teams, design teams. They gave them a challenge to come up with ideas about how to use biomimicry in the design. And one team went to Mexico City, and they studied natural environments, natural habitat zones. And what they discovered was, and particularly they discovered the mushroom communities had some very interesting properties. The long and short of it is they came out of that with certain decisions that they made. They studied what happens on the border of the transition areas. You talked about the buffer areas between the river and the urban environment. What happens in nature in buffer areas, right? And that what they found was most of the energy and activity is in that buffer area, right? So what they decided to do was they decided we should spend 50% of all our money on this eco-district in the buffer zones, as opposed to dumping most of your money in the main core area, right? And they also found that nature doesn't have abrupt transitions, right? It has very gradual and interconnected transitions. And so that has lessons for how you design urban areas, right? And knowing where the energy is going to come from. So these cities, Chicago, Portland, the Bay Area, Vancouver, New York is really highly focused now on biodiversity. They're using all these biophilia, biomimicry, in order to try and recreate, first of all, catalog biodiversity, all right? Why is that? What's the connection between biodiversity and urban areas, and basically life. The UN recently issued a report on the freshwater crisis on the planet. And this is a slide of Cocopah, Indian boy, northern Mexico, where their community used to fish and farm in the lower Colorado River Basin for 2,000 years. That is when it still completed its route to the sea, which it no longer does. The connection between water and biodiversity is clear. If you think it doesn't have any application for the West, this is a graph of the Colorado River Basin supply and demand. All right? That supply, the blue line, well, you know, it's done some meandering like a river, right? And there's occasional spikes up, but this demand line is a relentless march. That's population growth, obviously, exponential population growth. And so when those two lines cross, as an old antitrust lawyer, supply and demand, when those two lines cross, you have a recipe for scarcity and you have a problem, especially when it's a fixed supply. You don't know what the supply is going to look like, but you know what the demand is going to look like, right? So the UN has said, the Secretary General of the UN said, biodiversity and the ecosystem services it provides is key to achieving a water-secure world, all right? It's not just in the third world, it's in the first world, okay? We have to bring the biodiversity back, right? So one of the processes is, a principle that you need to remember is, biodiversity anywhere is biodiversity everywhere, all right? So you don't need to worry about, all I can do is bring parks into my urban environment. That's biodiversity. You're increasing biodiversity, right? And we need to cooperate with nature, because nature at its core is based on cooperation, not competition. And so what Laura's doing in terms of cooperating with all of these groups, that's at the human level, right? But she's also, they're cooperating with nature. They're learning to live within nature's principles. Nature has an inherent order. We need to learn how it functions, because it's going to have its way one way or the other, right? And by doing this, we can help to create ecological coherence, connecting habitat zones. That creates ecological coherence. Now, I can tell you, you don't have to worry about this too much, but Einstein would have told you, this happens at the quantum level, okay? Coherence is going on in nature at the quantum level. So ecological coherence creates coherence in nature. And when we're in nature, we experience that coherence. That's what's going on, right? So there's all kinds of challenges of habitat preservation, and Laura's outlined some of those. In Boulder, we've faced those challenges. You know, it has impact on development, you know, forces you into greater density because you have less land supply. You need to determine how that open space is going to interact with your development patterns, and funding, of course. Boulder has a unique funding model for what I'm about to show you. These are Boulder's habitat zones. I'm not going to get into that too much. The dark green is the county of Boulder, open space. Light green is the city of Boulder, all around the city of Boulder. Army green, and then there's BLM land, and other jurisdictions have open space. Right? Reconnecting those is a challenge. Boulder County has 97,000 acres of open space. The city of Boulder, a city of 100,000 people, has 45,000 acres of open space. And then other communities are filling in. So our funding model has been, we taxed ourselves. For 45 years now, we were the first community in the United States to have an open space tax that's self-imposed, where we give the money to the county, and it buys open space at properties coming onto the market. Now, sometimes we sell it back, and we allow them to have a farm, a working agricultural operation, but we always retain a conservation easement, okay, so that we maintain control over the land. Now, and I know I'm running short on time, another message is protect habitat wherever you can, okay? This is our osprey cam. We have a pair of osprey that had been coming back to this same utility pole in Longmont for 10 years. So we finally built them a new platform, put a live video feed there, and it's reality TV. You can watch them doing what they do, right? And then this is daytime on Boulder's open space. And so you got coyotes, bobcats, kittens, bear, mink. We have cameras everywhere. I highly recommend it. Get cameras. This is nighttime on Boulder's open space. Mountain lion, raccoons, another bobcat, beaver. All this leads to what I call natural resilience, okay? When you build all these principles around biophilia, you build natural resilience, okay? But it flows through biodiversity. And finally, I'm not going to tell you what happened I have an example of Mount St. Helens. Can I go through this? Mount St. Helens started out, very serene, and then it completely changed, right? Just completely buried the entire region. Spirit Lake was dead, completely dead. So what happened? After 30 years, they left it alone. We could have come in and created a theme park or, tried to impose human solutions on it. Nature's volunteers just did the work, okay? New forests emerged. Animals came back, herds of elk. Spirit Lake now, the fish are so big and numerous, they're thinking of opening it back up to fishermen because it's just too crowded. So that's nature's restorative power. If you can give the conditions for biophilia and a return of biodiversity to work, you're going to experience nature's power. So what happens as a result? Natural happiness. When nature's happy, doesn't matter if it's in a park, if it's in open space, wherever it is. When nature's happy, people are happy, okay? And when people are happy, you create synergy, right? They start to get the energy to find new solutions, okay? And if I can just have one slide to impress upon you, it's this one. Thomas Berry said, the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, okay? When you look at nature, don't look at it as natural assets, all right? Look at it as natural allies, because nature has its own evolutionary power. And when you work with it, when you work in communion with it, in flow with it, you can experience sudden, spontaneous results, okay? And all throughout these processes, as you go and you try to make new developments, remember, imagination is more important than knowledge. And I say that with love. I know there's a lot of people out in the audience who treasure knowledge, right? Einstein had a fair amount. He could do the math. But he valued imagination above everything else. And so when you allow creativity to exist, you're going to find amazing results. And lastly, if you're ever stumped, you don't know what to do, whether it's right or wrong, just get out into nature. Nature knows all the answers. Right? Thank you.
So Laura, can you hear me? Laura and Dan stuck to the orders and have allowed us time to have questions and interaction. So I've got some, but I want to first of all give people in the audience an opportunity to ask what's on your mind, pose some questions, challenge them. What do you think? Yeah.
For Laura, who's the most problematic stakeholder?
You know, we were chatting this morning. I don't know that there's one that's more problematic, really. I think, you know, everybody, I sort of use this as my benchmark that if somebody's mad at me, I'm doing the right thing. Because I'm always sort of trying to balance the interests of a developer, the environmental community, the recreation community, the local governments, the landowner, and you can't make everybody happy. I think we can find a middle ground, and it's going to take a lot of compromise. But I don't know that there's one stakeholder that's harder to work with than any other. There are certainly some that monopolize a little bit more of my time, but I think everybody serves a good role and a good purpose. So I ditched that question. Sorry.
Well, could you expand on what some of the hurdles are, bigger hurdles are that stakeholders?
Well, just sort of generally, I mean, our governing board, and I was sort of lamenting this a little bit this morning, but, you know, I don't get to choose who's on our board necessarily. We're just sort of assigned members by our member governments. And so achieving balance on the board is, I think, a challenge. And oftentimes, you know, we've got folks that have different interests in mind, and they run for you know, you have a certain interest in mind, and so you run for public office, or you have a certain interest in mind, so you become an environmental advocate. And trying to make sure that we have good representation of all of those voices on our board is hard. So right now we're structured where 2/3 of our board is made up of governmental members, so city council members, mayors. It's great networking. You get to meet all of these people in one meeting and build relationships with them all at once, but 2/3 there, and then 1/3 community partners. So, you know, within that community partners, trying to find someone who represents recreation, environment, utilities, landowners, businesses, education. So I think that's the hardest thing.
Somebody else? Okay, otherwise I've got a couple questions for our speakers. Laura, I wanted to ask you, you showed the map with the gold to tin or whatever the
Silver, bronze.
Gold, silver, bronze along the riverfront, and your rating system was the maximum, the gold was the place with the maximum space between the development and the river. And when new urbanists think about having density and having people live in dense places, one of the things they want is for people to have access to the natural asset in order to make living in a dense environment attractive, fun, viable, financially feasible. And so I was wondering about that rating system and why it came to be that way.
How did those jive?
Yeah, and how that jives.
That's a really good point, thanks. The gold, silver, bronze represents opportunities for environmental restoration and so ecological habitat, but we've also sort of balanced that with opportunities for community building in these river centers. And so the goal that I'm trying to advocate for is that finding areas where we have opportunities for redevelopment are those places, the prime opportunities for reconnecting people with the resource. You know, we have our State Fair Park, for example, is right on the Jordan River, and it also happens to intersect with the new North Temple light rail line. And so we've got this sort of interesting nexus of a big destination that needs a facelift, and they're sitting on a big bond and have the opportunity to do a lot of renovations there. This new transportation line, the trail, and the river, and can we use places like that where we have these natural opportunities to create those destinations, those nodes that attract people, like my folks, you know, who say, well, why would you want to go to the Jordan River? It's like, Mom, you know better. This is my job. Of course, it's beautiful. You come down there, check it out. But, you know, people who might not otherwise visit it, they may go to a destination like that. And if we have a broader base of public support like that, then the public officials are going to take it more seriously, and then we'll have more regulatory teeth to make the harder decisions. And so the gold, silver, bronze, I think, overlays with that, and I think it's punctuated by these opportunity areas, if that sort of answers the question.
One of the, let me see, I had a similar question for Dan that now that I'm fine. Okay. Dan, you mentioned that in biomimicry and in the lessons from a variety of, and looking at lessons from nature, that it was found that the most money should be spent at those transition areas and the buffers. And that, in my mind, I was thinking about the fact that you had earlier said in your talk, use every opportunity to green. And new urbanists in their projects are often faced with a trade-off, the cost trade-off of where to do what. And so I was struggling with the contrast of doing green everything, which isn't always possible. It might be a goal, but it isn't always possible. And your statement about greening at those transition zones, and I wondered if you could comment further on that and how you saw that playing out.
Yeah, and of course I was not involved directly in the exploration of those issues, but my understanding is that they studied those borders, right? The borders between habitats, different species, right? And found that that's where nature puts most of its energy, right? Because it knows that's where most of the demand is going to be and where it can be most efficient. So, but another concept that they discovered was that nature also leaves room for unused areas, right? So, you know, you all have had the experience where you have vacant lots and you have unused areas in your urban core that you feel compelled to do something with, and obviously that's a valuable thing. If those are assets that can be used in productive ways, you should probably use them. But nature allows for developers, essentially, you know, space where it doesn't prescribe what's going to be done, because it knows that at some point in time, activity from the borders will come and make use of that space in the way that is most efficient, right? So those are just some lessons about how we can just take a step back and look at, okay, all of my training tells me, well, I've got to get rid of that blight, right? And use it for something specific, useful in my current development. And I've got to fit it in with my budget, and I've got to be able to do it, you know, in a nice way, and so that limits what I can do, right? But it may be that you want to think about allowing groups outside your development to determine what's the right use of that space, right? And to determine what goes on at the borders. This is just an example. All nature has specific lessons in a lot of other areas. So, for example, they've taken a look at, you know, the bumps on the front of whales' fins, right? And they always thought those were just kind of an anomaly. What are those for? They can't be for efficiency, right? But after all the testing, they found out that they can make wind turbines more efficient by including those kinds of bumps, essentially, on the front of the blades rather than the back of the blades, okay? So there's another example. They looked at sunflowers, all right? There was a concentrated solar power development where they were having trouble getting efficiencies because of the placement of the arrays had to be such that they were partially shaded by each other, right? And so they were trying to come up with new ways of looking at that. And they actually ran it through a computer model with another group in Europe. And they said, well, that's already done, all right, by sunflowers. Look at the center of a sunflower. The pattern of that vegetation, essentially, is what they call a Fibonacci pattern. So they took that and they redesigned their solar array from an amphitheater type setting, which is usually how they did it, to this specific Fibonacci sequence. And they found that they got tremendous efficiency gains out of it. So all I'm saying is, look, there are resources out there where nature's lessons are being applied at all scales, in all areas. I don't know what it has for developers, right? But I know that it's there. And they just have to step out and say, okay, I've got a certain amount of money. What can I do with it? Well, let me look and see if there's a more efficient way to spend my money, right? By looking at nature, instead of just thinking, the model tells me these are the only things that I can do.
Other questions? Nobody's going to challenge either of them in this room? Yes, Scott.
You said something interesting to me that I hadn't heard from you before. You said the rights of nature and the rights to nature. Is the rights to nature the way into our jurisprudence system? Because it seems like there's a gap. The notion of rights of nature, it seems like there's just, you're always going to get the excuse, well, if you allow nature to have its own rights, where do you stop? You eat things eat other things. At some point, you have to just say, we have a human order, they're not part of it for this kind of rationalization. Is the rights to nature the way to bring it into the human process, the human jurisprudence? Because it seems like otherwise, the gap is just too big and you're always going to just be dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat the question, people in the back?
Yeah, the question is, are the rights to nature the way to tie in human rights, essentially, and existing bodies of law, the existing jurisprudence around property rights, for example, individual rights, is that the way to reconcile the rights of nature with the rights to nature? And the answer is yes, okay? But it takes a shift, two shifts. The first one is, we're not separate from nature, okay? We have the same rights as every other natural being, right? We have the right to exist, we have a right to habitat, and we have the right to play our role in the great community, let's call it the environment or the ecosystem, right? And so I have drafted a rights of nature ordinance that is enforceable, has enforcement mechanisms to, first of all, take individual property rights, ownership rights, and not wrest those rights away from the individual, but simply impose a trusteeship obligation on the individual, all right? So it's a public trust doctrine that we are trustees for whatever property, whatever land or nature that we own, right? And in my view, there's always conflicts among the rights of nature, all right? The lion has a conflict clearly with the gazelle, vice versa. But that's a conflict that can be resolved by looking to the health of the ecosystem as a whole, all right? The lion has the right to habitat, a food supply. The gazelle has a right to habitat. The gazelle also has the right to play its role in the ecosystem, one of which is to be prey for the lion, right? Now, we have certain needs for energy. That's why fracking is one of those areas where it's conflict, okay? We have a need for energy, but it has to be sustainable. It can't violate the rights of the wildlife. It can't create that conflict, because the way to resolve all of those conflicts is to look to the health of the ecosystem as a whole, okay? So that's what I do in this draft ordinance. I say any conflict that you have between interactions between individual property rights and the rights of nature. So for example, can I cut down a tree on my land, right? Well, first of all, it has to cause substantial harm, not just to the tree, but to the ecosystem or the natural community in which it exists. So if I have prairie dogs on my property? Do I have the right to just poison them all, right? Well, no, because that would cause substantial harm not just to those individual prairie dogs, but to the community in which they exist, which has impacts on the environment in which they exist, okay? Nothing is separate, right? But there is in law and in existing jurisprudence, there is this concept of de minimis harm, right? I have the right to remove 4 shrubs from my lawn, right? If I want to plant new ones or if I don't want to plant new ones. Why? I'm harming nature, no question about it. But I'm not harming the ecosystem, right? Not in any way. Now, if I want to cut down a grove of trees, that's another question, okay? And so it can always be reconciled by first realizing we're not separate from nature. We don't have superior rights to nature. But second, that we need to shift our focus from either harm specifically to an individual member of nature, including us, to what's good for the ecosystem as a whole. Because if we don't preserve, protect through the jurisprudence system, the ecosystem as a whole, we are not viable as a species. That's what Thomas Berry's message was, okay? We have to create a viable human-earth relationship, and the law can do that, right? It has done that in indigenous populations, Native American communities. They have a different view of what the law is around the rights of nature and the rights of humans. And so it doesn't mean we need to go back, to prehistoric times, right? There are obviously modern challenges. But if we can focus on the health of the ecosystem as opposed to our own individual survival or our own economic impact, then we'll start to create the conditions for it all to be coherent. Right.
I want to thank both of our panelists, Laura and Dan. Thank you all for being part of this discussion. I think Laura and Dan will be around a little bit if people have other things they'd like to cover with them one-on-one instead of in front of the group. Thanks very much for being here.